pointed this out extremely clearly. The might of Britain was built in the 18th and 19th centuries on the ruin of India. And essentially, when India went from 23% share of the global economy in the early 18th century to less than 4% when the British left, the reason that happened quite simply was because Britain's industrial revolution was built on the deindustrialization of India, the destruction of Indian textiles, their substitution by manufacturing in England, using Indian raw materials and exporting the finished products back to India. The handloom weavers of Bengal, for example, produced wonderful muslin, fine as the woven air, some said, had their looms destroyed, their thumbs cut off in a notorious incident. Duties and tariffs were imposed on Indian cloth, while the British instead flooded India and the world with cheaper fabric. The cotton grown in India and the satanic mills of Lancashire, not my phrase, spinning and weaving them and selling them to the rest of the world. So weavers became beggars, manufacturing collapsed, in addition to the collapse of Agra and Maharaja Ranjit Singh's magnificent Lahore, which never forgot their elides. The population of Dhaka fell by 90% in the first 5 decades of British rule, because it was once the great center of muslin production, and it ceased to exist as such. So this was the tragedy, the economic tragedy that's already been well brought out. Robert Clive was mentioned. He came and bought his rotten borough in England on the proceeds of his rapacity in India, while publicly marveling at his own self-restraint in not having looted even more than he did. And loot, of course, was an Indian word they took into their dictionaries as well as their habits. And the Brits had the gall to call him Clive of India, as if he belonged to my country, when all he really did was to ensure that much of my country belonged to him. By the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's biggest cash cow, the world's biggest buyer of British exports, and provided highly paid work for British civil servants, all at India's own expense. We literally paid for our own oppression. I mean, no wonder the sun never set on the British Empire. Even God couldn't trust the Englishman in the dark. Now, Poiting is touchingly concerned about the lack of democracy and humanitarianism until the British brought them along. Well, let me point out that as Britain ruthlessly exploited India, somewhere between 15 and 30 million Indians died completely unnecessary deaths under British rule because of starvation. Millions of tons of wheat were exported to Britain even as famine raged. 4 million Bengalis starved to death during the Great Bengal Famine of 1943 after Churchill deliberately ordered the diversion of food from starving Indian civilians to well-supplied British soldiers and European stockpiles. He said the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis is less serious than that of sturdy Greeks, and I'm actually quoting Churchill. When officers of conscience pointed out a telegram to the Prime Minister the tragedy that was being caused in India by his decisions, his only response, Churchill's, was to ask peevishly, well, why isn't Gandhi dead yet? Now, British imperialism has long justified itself with the pretense that it was a form of enlightened despotism conducted for the benefit of the governed. Churchill's inhumane conduct, of course, gave the lie to this myth, but it had been battered for 2 centuries already, Kwasi. British imperialism had triumphed not just by conquest and deception, but by blowing rebels to bits from the mouths of cannons, massacring unarmed protesters at Jallianwala Bagh, upholding iniquity through institutionalized racism, exemplified by Churchill. Whereas as late as the 1940s it was possible for a black African to say with pride, moi je suis français, in West Africa, it was never possible for an Indian to consider himself British. He was always a subject, never a citizen. It actually took the end of British colonialism to make that possible. So if we took it for a historic view rather than a hydraulic one, I think we would not argue that India benefited more than it lost. The Indian railways have been mentioned. Lots of countries have built railways without being colonized by the British to do so. What is more, it was a magnificent British scam because the investors from Britain were guaranteed rates of return double that of government bonds in this country, paid for by Indian taxes. Private enterprise at public risk, Britain's private enterprise, India's private risk. The English language, since 2 of you have mentioned that we are grateful for it, and we are, we're very happy to have Shakespeare and P.G. Wodehouse, but you could have sent us a whole bunch of toothsome instead of sturdy Welsh master sergeants to impart it to us. Let me point out that English was not a deliberate gift but an instrument of colonialism. Macaulay said very explicitly that he wanted to create a class of interpreters between the government and the British in order to advance British imperial goals. And let me finally point out Scotland, since our chairman mentioned it and no one took him up on it, which is quite simply, what cemented the union with Scotland? Very simply, before 1707, the Scots tried to set up colonies elsewhere in the world. They failed. It's when they joined England that the loot available to the East India Company kept Scotland in the policy. India gone. No wonder you need to fix it.
You see why they call him the hammer of Aloxara. I think a collective round of applause for all.
The first thing I want to pick up is this idea of the law, which I think, given our surroundings and given the fact that a distinguished member of our judiciary has mentioned it, is absolutely central. Of course, the rule of law is critical in any development of civil society. And it is true that the British Empire, or British colonialism, was in many ways responsible for the spreading of the rule of law across the empire. Now, someone else mentioned India and China, and I think this is a wonderful point of comparison. If you compare modern India and modern China, if you compare the freedom of the expression, if you compare the openness, if you can compare parliamentary democracy with what goes on in today's China, you have more or less answered the question of this debate. And what has struck me about this debate, given that we're in 2014, as William Dalrymple reminds us, is the fact that it's the most eloquent defense of the Mughal Empire I've ever heard. I mean, it's almost as if everything I learned about Mughal imperialism should be thrown out of the window, and I should recognize in the Mughal Empire as this great, enlightened, humanitarian, and recognizing equal rights empire that ever existed. Of course, this is a complete fantasy, and not even a skilled and as imaginative a writer as William Dalrymple can ever convince us that a continuation of Mughal India would somehow have given India the benefits that British colonialism extended. Now, this isn't to say that British colonialism was all good. I mean, clearly there were horrific crimes, horrific injustices, and oppressions that resulted from British imperialism. But what I ask you, and I think it's very simple, the difference between that side and ours. They are brilliant historians, and they have talked eloquently about India's history, about Mughal history, about the history of Indian civilization for over 1,000 years. On this side, we're trying to look at the future of India. That's the difference between an opposition which is constantly harping about the oppressions of the past and a proposition which is saying, yes, there were bad things about the British imperial experience, but there were also some very, very good things, which in the future will accrue more and more benefits to India and its people. And I urge you, when you consider your vote, to reject, I mean, history is fascinating, it's my favourite subject, but it's not relevant to India's future. The gifts, if you like, of British imperial connection, colonial connection, are things which India can use in its future. I think that the crimes of the past should best be left to the historians and the history books.
Thank you. The first set of rebuttal from the opposition, Councillor Shashi Tharoor.
I mean, I think there were some very important things said both from the audience here about some of the positives, and I think we should concede the importance of the English language, cricket, and the rule of law, as the distinguished Supreme Court judge suggested. But with footnotes to all of those, I'm afraid. As far as the English language is concerned, I mentioned this briefly in my remarks, but the fact is that I'd rather quote Macaulay's own words. We must do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons, Indians in blood and colour, but English in taste and opinions and morals and in intellect. So the language was taught to a few to serve as intermediaries between the rulers and the ruled, and that we seized upon the English language and turned it into an instrument for our own liberation was to our credit, not by British design. And I think that has to be noted. The rule of law. I mean, obviously we're all glad to have it, but still Britain did saddle us with an adversarial system, excessively bogged down in procedural formalities, which Indians are very good at multiplying, a legacy of interminable trials and long-pending cases far removed from India's traditional systems of justice. And the laws are enforced by a colonial-era police system, which in the British Empire was based on the Irish constabulary and not the London bobby. So it was not an instrument, it was not a community policing, but an instrument of oppression. And that, sadly, was the legacy we were given. Democracy. I mean, the argument that Britain left us with training quasi and self-governing institutional trappings of democracy is preposterous to anyone who knows how hard it was for the Indian nationalist movement to win even a smidgen of self-government after so many repeatedly broken British promises. And let me, about the experience of the instilling of democracy, read you a letter from Jawaharlal Nehru to Lord Lothian. British rule, he wrote, is based on an extreme form of widespread violence, and the only sanction is fear. It suppresses the usual liberties which are supposed to be essential to the growth of a people. It crushes the adventurous, the brave, the sensitive, and encourages the timid, the opportunist, the time-serving, the sneak, and the bully. It surrounds itself with a vast army of spies and informers and agents provocateurs. Is this the atmosphere in which the more desirable virtues grow or democratic institutions flourish? And Nehru went on to speak of, and I quote again, the crushing of human dignity and decency, the injuries to the soul as well as the body, which degrades those who use it as well as those who suffer from it. Again, the British ultimately, reluctantly gave India a form of partial self-government, which it took away when it chose to declare war without the consent of those who had sufficiently been elected to represent the Indian people. I will not give Britain more credit than that for democracy. And the truth is, in any case, that you have this wonderful British perversion of electing a legislature to form the executive, which has saddled us in India with legislators who are not interested in legislating, but who are actually anxious to get elected to form the government. Something which, the logic of which might appeal in a tiny island nation with people of coherent ideas and views, but in our country has often been a recipe for chaos, indecision, and indifference. So another system might have worked more efficiently. As for cricket, you're right. The Indian scholar said that it was a game, an Indian game accidentally discovered by the British. But we did invent it, perhaps, to humiliate us. We did it at the Oval this summer. So you have the Oval, we have Lagan.